Introduction. Science has given us wonders that shape our world, from life-saving medicines to the technologies we use every day. But behind some of these breakthroughs lie stories of doubt, remorse, and unintended consequences. In this video, we'll explore the lives of scientists who changed history, only to later question what they had set in motion. Some of their creations brought progress, others brought destruction, and all left a mark on humanity that cannot be erased. Join me as we uncover these fascinating, and sometimes sobering, stories. Alfred Nobel and Dynamite. In the middle of the 19th century, the world was changing rapidly. Industry was expanding, cities were growing, and the need for faster construction and more efficient mining was greater than ever before. But the work of breaking rock and shaping the earth was slow and dangerous. Black powder, the explosive of choice for centuries, was unpredictable and weak compared to the demands of the new industrial age. It was in this atmosphere of ambition and danger that Alfred Nobel began his experiments. Alfred Nobel was born in 1833 in Stockholm, Sweden, into a family that valued invention and engineering. His father, Emanuel Nobel, was an inventor and industrialist who worked on a variety of projects, from bridges to explosives. The young Alfred grew up surrounded by machines, tools, and the quiet hum of scientific curiosity. He learned early that progress was often built on trial, error, and persistence. By the 1860s, Nobel was fascinated by a substance called nitroglycerin. It had been discovered by Ascanio Sobrero in 1847, but Sobrero warned that it was far too unstable for practical use. Even small movements or changes in temperature could set it off, often with deadly consequences. Despite these dangers, Nobel believed that nitroglycerin could be harnessed safely, turning its destructive potential into a powerful tool for construction. He began experimenting, often in remote locations to avoid accidents in populated areas. His early work was not without tragedy. In 1864, a massive explosion at one of Nobel's laboratories in Stockholm killed several people, including his younger brother Emil. The accident deeply affected him, yet instead of abandoning his research, Nobel became even more determined to find a way to control nitroglycerin's volatile nature. The breakthrough came when Nobel discovered that mixing nitroglycerin with an inert absorbent material, such as diatomaceous earth, stabilized it. The result was a paste-like substance that could be shaped into rods and inserted into drilling holes for blasting. This new material was far less sensitive to shock and temperature changes, yet still retained nitroglycerin's incredible explosive power. Nobel patented his invention in 1867, calling it dynamite, a name derived from the Greek word dynamis, meaning power. Dynamite revolutionized construction, mining, and infrastructure development. Tunnels could be carved through mountains with unprecedented speed. Railroads could expand across continents. Harbors, canals, and massive building foundations became easier to construct. Nobel's invention became a symbol of industrial progress, and demand for it spread across the globe. But as the years passed, Nobel began to see another side to his creation. Dynamite was not used solely for building. It was also adopted by armies and insurgent groups. It became a weapon in conflicts, its power turned against people rather than stone. Acts of sabotage, assassinations, and military campaigns increasingly relied on dynamite to create devastation. The turning point for Nobel came in an unexpected and personal way. In 1888, his brother Ludwig died in France, but several newspapers mistakenly published Alfred's obituary instead. One headline called him the Merchant of Death, condemning him for profiting from explosives that had taken countless lives. Reading his own obituary forced Nobel to confront the legacy he was creating. This moment of reflection stayed with him. Though he continued his business ventures, Nobel became determined to shape a different memory for the world. He began to plan how his fortune could be used to promote peace, science, and human achievement. In his will, written in 1895, Nobel allocated the majority of his wealth to establish the Nobel Prizes, awards that would honor those who contributed to humanity in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. When Alfred Nobel died in 1896, the first prizes were still years away from being awarded, but his decision had already transformed the narrative of his life. Dynamite had made him wealthy and famous, but it had also burdened him with the knowledge that invention can be as destructive as it is constructive. By dedicating his fortune to the recognition of peaceful and intellectual achievements, Nobel sought to balance the scales. Today, his name is remembered not only for the explosive that changed the world, but for the prizes that celebrate the very best of human endeavor. And yet, the story of Alfred Nobel and dynamite remains a powerful reminder. Even the most well-intentioned discoveries can lead to consequences their creators never imagined. Robert Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb. In the early decades of the 20th century, physics was undergoing a profound transformation. Old certainties about the nature of matter were breaking apart under the force of new discoveries. The atom, once thought to be the smallest, indivisible unit of existence, was revealed to be a universe in itself, a structure of particles bound by forces so powerful they could scarcely be imagined. Theoretical equations hinted at energies locked away in the heart of matter, energies that, if ever released, could dwarf the might of any explosion humanity had ever known. Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born in 1904 in New York City, into a wealthy family of cultured, intellectual leanings. From an early age, he displayed an unusual brilliance. Words, ideas, and abstract concepts fascinated him. He read deeply in literature, mastered multiple languages, and showed a natural gift for mathematics and physics. At Harvard, Cambridge, and later Göttingen, Oppenheimer absorbed the new quantum theories, working alongside some of the greatest scientific minds of his generation. He was drawn to the elegance of theoretical physics, the precision of mathematics describing the hidden architecture of reality. When war swept across the world in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the theoretical world of Oppenheimer's work collided with a stark new reality. Reports from Europe confirmed that German scientists were investigating nuclear fission, the splitting of the atomic nucleus, and that the process released an enormous amount of energy. In the wrong hands, such knowledge could be shaped into a weapon unlike any in history. The United States, determined not to be outpaced, began an unprecedented scientific and engineering effort. In 1942, the Manhattan Project was born, and Robert Oppenheimer was chosen as its scientific director. It was a role that would test not only his intellect but his conscience. Oppenheimer oversaw the gathering of an extraordinary assembly of talent, Nobel laureates, young prodigies, seasoned engineers, all brought to a secret city in the desert of New Mexico, Los Alamos. There, in a place of quiet mesas and wide horizons, they worked day and night on a problem of immense complexity: how to turn the theoretical chain reaction of uranium and plutonium into a controlled, deliverable weapon. The atmosphere at Los Alamos was both intense and surreal. Oppenheimer's charisma and intellect inspired those around him, and his leadership kept the vast and fragmented effort moving forward. Yet beneath the sense of urgency lay an unspoken truth. They were building something designed not for construction, but for destruction on an unprecedented scale. By July 1945, after years of calculations, experiments, and trials, the weapon was ready to be tested. The chosen site was a remote stretch of desert known as the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man. At dawn on July 16th, a blinding light erupted across the sky as the first atomic bomb exploded. The shockwave rolled across the desert, and a towering mushroom cloud rose into the heavens. In that instant, Oppenheimer remembered a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was not a cry of triumph but of recognition, a moment when the abstract equations of physics had become a terrible reality. Only weeks later, the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more suffered from burns, radiation, and the destruction of their cities. The war ended, but the price was almost beyond comprehension. Oppenheimer traveled to the White House to meet President Truman. In that meeting, he confessed that he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman, angered, dismissed him as naive, but Oppenheimer's words revealed the depth of his private anguish. In the years that followed, Oppenheimer became a prominent public figure. He advocated for the international control of nuclear weapons, warning that the arms race would only bring the world closer to catastrophe. His opposition to the development of the even more powerful hydrogen bomb put him at odds with political leaders and some of his colleagues. Eventually, during the height of Cold War suspicion, his security clearance was revoked in a highly publicized hearing, a symbolic silencing of the man once hailed as the father of the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer withdrew from public life, turning to teaching, writing, and quiet reflection. He remained deeply conflicted about his role in history. While he acknowledged that the atomic bomb may have hastened the end of the war, he understood that its creation had opened a door that could never be closed. The technology had escaped the laboratory. The power to destroy entire cities was now a permanent feature of the human condition. In 1966, less than a year before his death, he accepted the Enrico Fermi Award from the U.S. government. It was a gesture of reconciliation, though it did little to erase the moral weight he carried. Robert Oppenheimer died in 1967, his legacy a complex mixture of genius, leadership, and regret. His life stands as a meditation on the paradox of scientific discovery. The same intellect that can illuminate the secrets of the universe can also create shadows deep enough to engulf it. The story of Robert Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb is not just a chapter in the history of science, but a cautionary reminder of the choices that shape the destiny of nations, and the conscience of those who hold such power in their hands. Mikhail Kalashnikov and the AK-47. In the years following the Second World War, the Soviet Union was rebuilding from unimaginable devastation. Entire cities lay in ruins, millions of lives had been lost, and the country's military leadership was determined never again to be caught unprepared for conflict. One lesson from the war was clear. Modern soldiers needed a reliable, simple, and effective automatic weapon that could perform in almost any condition. Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov was born in 1919 in the rural Altai region of Siberia. The son of a peasant family, his early life was marked by hardship. He had a natural talent for mechanics and a fascination with machinery, often repairing farm equipment and creating small devices from spare parts. His path to becoming one of the most famous weapons designers in history began not in a laboratory, but on the front lines. In 1941, Kalashnikov was serving as a tank commander in the Red Army when he was seriously wounded during the Battle of Bryansk. While recovering in a hospital, he overheard wounded soldiers complaining about the unreliability of their weapons. Rifles that jammed in the mud, submachine guns with limited range, firearms too delicate for the brutal realities of war. Lying in his hospital bed, Kalashnikov began sketching ideas for a new type of rifle. One that would be durable, easy to maintain, and effective in combat. Over the next several years, he worked on prototypes, refining the design with the help of experienced gunsmiths and military engineers. By 1947, his work had produced the Avtomat Kalashnikova Model 1947, the AK-47. It combined elements from other successful firearms with Kalashnikov's own innovations, resulting in a weapon that was simple, rugged, and could function in sand, snow, or rain with minimal maintenance. The AK-47 quickly became the standard infantry weapon for the Soviet military and, over time, for countless armed forces and insurgent groups around the world. It could be mass-produced cheaply, operated by soldiers with minimal training, and used in almost any environment. For many, it was a symbol of Soviet strength and resilience. But as the years passed, Kalashnikov began to see another side of his creation. The AK-47 spread far beyond the control of the Soviet Union. It appeared in the hands of guerrilla fighters, child soldiers, rebels, and criminals. It was used in revolutions, civil wars, and acts of terrorism. By the late 20th century, the silhouette of the rifle had become one of the most recognized shapes in the world, a presence in news footage from conflict zones across continents. Kalashnikov often defended his work by saying that he had designed the rifle for the defense of his country, not for aggression. Yet as he grew older, the moral questions deepened. In interviews late in life, he admitted to feeling personal sorrow for the countless deaths caused by the weapon that bore his name. "I am haunted by the fact that my invention is used by terrorists," he once remarked. "I created it to protect the borders of my homeland." In 2013, shortly before his death, Kalashnikov wrote a letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, expressing his spiritual turmoil. In it, He wondered aloud whether he bore responsibility for the many lives lost to his invention. It was a rare and intimate confession from a man who had spent most of his life celebrated as a hero of Soviet engineering. Mikhail Kalashnikov died later that year at the age of 94. By then, it was estimated that over 100 million AK-type rifles had been produced worldwide, more than any other firearm in history. The weapon's reputation as both a tool of liberation and a symbol of violence ensured that his legacy would remain complex and contested. The story of Kalashnikov and the AK-47 is one of innovation born from necessity, yet shadowed by the unintended consequences of success. It is a reminder that even the most practical inventions can take on lives of their own, shaping history in ways their creators could never fully predict, and sometimes could not bear to imagine. Fritz Haber and chemical warfare. In the early 20th century, Germany stood at the forefront of chemistry. The nation's universities and research institutions were producing discoveries that would shape industry, medicine, and agriculture for decades to come. Among the most celebrated figures of this era was Fritz Haber, a man whose intellect and ambition carried him from modest beginnings to the pinnacle of scientific achievement, and whose legacy would forever be marked by one of history's darkest applications of science. Fritz Haber was born in 1868 in Breslau, then part of the German Empire. He grew up in a Jewish family, though he later converted to Christianity in pursuit of greater acceptance in German society. From an early age, he showed a restless curiosity and an eagerness to master the new sciences of his age. Chemistry fascinated him most of all, offering the promise of transforming the raw materials of the earth into tools for progress. By the early 1900s, one of the world's most urgent challenges was food production. The growing global population demanded more crops, yet the supply of natural fertilizers was limited. Haber, working with the chemist Carl Bosch, achieved something that had eluded scientists for decades: a method to synthesize ammonia from nitrogen in the air and hydrogen gas under high temperature and pressure. This breakthrough, known as the Haber-Bosch process, allowed the mass production of nitrogen fertilizers, dramatically increasing agricultural yields. It was an achievement so profound that it has been credited with sustaining billions of lives. In 1918, Haber was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for this work. But the same scientific mind that had given the world a solution to hunger would also deliver one of the most feared weapons of modern war. When World War I broke out in 1914, Germany faced a stalemate on the Western Front. Conventional artillery and rifles were causing massive casualties. Yet neither side could break the deadlock of trench warfare. Haber believed that chemistry could change the course of the conflict. He proposed using chlorine gas as a weapon, heavier than air, capable of rolling silently across the battlefield, and lethal when inhaled. At first, the idea shocked many military leaders, but Haber assured them it was a legitimate military tactic that could end the war quickly. He personally oversaw the preparation and deployment of the first large-scale chemical attack, which took place on April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres. That evening, as the wind shifted toward the Allied trenches, clouds of yellow-green gas crept across no man's land. The soldiers caught in its path struggled to breathe, their lungs burning, their eyes seared. Panic spread as thousands collapsed, dying in agony. The attack shattered the stalemate temporarily, but it also ushered in a new and terrifying dimension of warfare. Haber returned to Berlin a hero in the eyes of the German military. Yet his triumph came at a terrible personal cost. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, herself a chemist and one of the first women in Germany to earn a PhD in chemistry, was deeply opposed to his work on chemical weapons. She saw it as a betrayal of the ideals of science, a turning of knowledge toward the deliberate mass killing of human beings. Only days after Haber returned from Ypres, Clara took her own life, reportedly using his military pistol. The tragedy cast a shadow over his achievements, though Haber rarely spoke of it in public. As the war continued, chemical weapons became a fixture of the battlefield, causing over 1 million casualties and horrifying soldiers and civilians alike. Haber remained committed to his work for the German war effort, developing new gases and delivery systems. To him, it was a matter of national duty. To his critics, it was the willful perversion of science into an instrument of mass death. After the war, Haber's reputation was deeply divided. Internationally, he was condemned for his role in introducing chemical warfare. At home, he was still recognized for his industrial and agricultural contributions. He continued to work in chemistry during the 1920s, leading research into pesticides and other chemicals. Ironically, one of the pesticides developed in his institute, Zyklon B, would later be repurposed for mass killings during the Holocaust, decades after his death and against his intentions. In 1933, with the rise of the Nazi regime, Haber, despite his service to Germany, was forced to leave the country because of his Jewish heritage. He spent his final years in exile, moving between Switzerland and England, his health failing. He died in 1934, far from the laboratories and institutions where he had once been celebrated. Fritz Haber's life is often described as a story of two legacies, one that fed the world and one that poisoned it. His work on ammonia synthesis remains one of the most important scientific achievements of the modern age, while his role in pioneering chemical warfare is remembered as a chilling example of science in service of destruction. The contradiction is stark, and it endures. Haber's story reminds us that science itself is neutral, but the purposes to which it is applied are shaped by human choices, choices that can elevate life or bring it to its knees. His life stands as a testament to both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths to which it can be turned when morality yields to ambition. Thomas Midgley Jr. and leaded gasoline. The early decades of the 20th century were an age of mechanical optimism. The automobile had begun to reshape cities, connect distant towns, and redefine personal freedom. But behind the romantic image of the open road lay a host of practical engineering problems. Engines of the time suffered from a persistent flaw known as knocking, a rattling metallic sound caused by premature combustion of the fuel-air mixture inside the cylinders. Knocking reduced performance, damaged engines, and frustrated drivers. The race was on to find a solution. Thomas Midgley Jr., an American mechanical engineer and chemist, joined General Motors in 1916, bringing with him a natural curiosity and a knack for inventive thinking. Working under Charles Kettering at the Dayton Research Laboratories, Midgley began experimenting with fuel additives in search of a compound that could suppress knocking. He tested hundreds of substances, from iodine to camphor, but most failed to deliver the necessary effect. Then, in December 1921, he found it, tetraethyl lead. In small amounts, this compound dramatically reduced engine knock, allowing engines to run more smoothly and with higher compression ratios. The results were so promising that General Motors quickly partnered with Standard Oil and DuPont to produce the additive on a commercial scale. They marketed it under the benign-sounding name ethyl, deliberately avoiding the word lead, which already carried associations of toxicity. The introduction of leaded gasoline was hailed as a triumph of engineering. It promised more powerful and efficient engines, paving the way for faster, more durable cars. For a time, it seemed like a clear win for progress. But the dangers of lead were not unknown. Medical literature dating back centuries had documented its poisonous effects on the human body, especially the nervous system. Still, the potential profits and technical advantages outweighed the concerns in the minds of industry leaders. Production of tetraethyl lead proved hazardous from the very start. Workers at the manufacturing plants began suffering from strange symptoms: confusion, hallucinations, seizures. At the DuPont facility in New Jersey, several men died after acute lead exposure. Newspapers reported on what they called loony gas incidents, but the companies insisted that the additive was safe when handled properly. Midgley himself, in a dramatic public demonstration, poured the compound over his hands and inhaled its vapors, claiming it posed no danger. Privately, however, he knew the risks. Shortly after that demonstration, he took a long leave of absence to recover from lead poisoning. Despite these warning signs, leaded gasoline rapidly became the industry standard. For decades, cars around the world emitted fine particles of lead into the air, contaminating soil, water, and human bodies. Studies would later reveal that lead exposure from gasoline contributed to widespread health problems, particularly in children. Reduced IQ, developmental delays, and behavioral issues. The damage was not confined to a single generation. Lead persisted in the environment, its effects compounding over time. Midgley's career did not end with leaded fuel. In the 1930s, he turned his attention to refrigeration and air conditioning, which relied on toxic or flammable coolants like ammonia and sulfur dioxide. Seeking a safer alternative, he developed a new class of compounds called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, marketed under the trade name Freon. CFCs quickly became the standard refrigerants and propellants for countless products. For a time, it seemed that Midgley had once again solved a critical technical problem. Yet, decades later, scientists discovered that CFCs were destroying the ozone layer, the Earth's protective shield against harmful ultraviolet radiation. The environmental consequences were global, and their reversal would require an international effort that continues to this day. By the end of the 20th century, Thomas Midgley Jr.'s inventions were widely cited as examples of unintended technological harm. Historian J.R. McNeill famously remarked that Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. The man who had once been celebrated for his ingenuity had, without intending it, created two of the most damaging environmental legacies of the modern age. Midgley himself never lived to see the full consequences. Stricken with polio in 1940, he became partially paralyzed and devised an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys to help him get in and out of bed. In 1944, he died at the age of 55, reportedly entangled in that very system. A tragic, almost symbolic end for a man whose devices had ensnared the world in consequences far beyond his imagining. The story of Thomas Midgley Jr. is one of remarkable ingenuity paired with a sobering lesson. Solutions to one problem can become the seeds of another. It is a reminder that innovation, however well-intentioned, must be weighed not only for its immediate benefits but for its unseen, far-reaching effects. The mark of progress is not just what we can build, but how carefully we can foresee and prevent the harm it might bring. Edward Teller and the hydrogen bomb. In the tense years that followed the Second World War, the world entered a new and uneasy age. The atomic bomb had ended the conflict, but it had also introduced a frightening reality. Humanity now possessed the means to destroy entire cities in moments. Nations that had once measured power in armies and fleets now measured it in kilotons and megatons. The uneasy peace that followed was built not on trust, but on the knowledge that a new war could bring devastation beyond imagination. Edward Teller was born in Budapest, Hungary, in 1908. A brilliant child with an insatiable curiosity, he left Europe in the 1930s, as the rise of fascism drove many Jewish scientists into exile. He came to the United States, where his talents found a place in the growing community of physicists pushing the boundaries of nuclear theory. During the war, Teller worked on the Manhattan Project, though his role was more peripheral than that of Robert Oppenheimer and others. Even then, however, he was fascinated by an idea far more powerful than the atomic bomb. A weapon that would harness the fusion of hydrogen atoms, the same process that fuels the sun. Fusion promised a staggering increase in explosive yield. Where fission split atoms apart, fusion fused them together, releasing vastly more energy in the process. The theoretical hydrogen bomb would not just be more powerful, it would be in an entirely different category of destruction. But in the early years after the war, many scientists opposed pursuing it. Some, like Oppenheimer, argued that the atomic bomb was already more than enough to deter enemies, and that building a far stronger weapon would only push the world closer to catastrophe. In 1949, those debates took on a new urgency. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear weapons. Fear of falling behind drove policymakers in Washington to reconsider their stance on fusion. Teller became one of the most vocal advocates for the hydrogen bomb program. He argued that in a dangerous world, the United States could not afford to be second in such a decisive field of military technology. The work was secretive, complex, and unlike anything attempted before. Fusion required temperatures and pressures far greater than those produced by fission alone. The solution came from physicist Stanislaw Ulam, whose design concept, with Teller's refinements, made the hydrogen bomb feasible. In 1952, the United States tested its first thermonuclear device, codenamed Ivy Mike, on the remote Inuiatak Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. The explosion was unimaginably powerful, a fireball 3 miles wide, a mushroom cloud towering into the stratosphere, and a blast yield of over 10 megatons, hundreds of times greater than the bombs dropped on Japan. For Teller, it was a moment of vindication. But for many others, it was the beginning of a terrifying new chapter. The hydrogen bomb was not a weapon of war in any traditional sense. It was a weapon of annihilation. Its destructive radius was so vast that it could erase entire metropolitan areas, leaving little more than scorched earth and radioactive fallout. Teller's unwavering support for the weapon soon put him in conflict with many of his former colleagues. During the heated political climate of the 1950s, he testified against Oppenheimer during a security clearance hearing, suggesting that Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb made him a national security risk. This act deeply alienated Teller from much of the scientific community, who saw it as a betrayal. In the decades that followed, Teller continued to work on nuclear weapons policy and technology, becoming a prominent voice for maintaining and expanding the United States nuclear arsenal. He believed strongly in the idea of peace through strength, arguing that overwhelming power was the surest way to prevent conflict. He also championed controversial projects, such as the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to develop space-based systems capable of intercepting nuclear missiles. Yet as the years passed, the scale of the nuclear arms race became undeniable. By the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough warheads to destroy the planet many times over. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of potential nuclear war, practicing duck and cover drills, and living with the knowledge that life could be ended in less than an hour's notice. Teller lived to see the Cold War end, but his relationship with his own legacy remained complex. To some, he was the father of the hydrogen bomb, a visionary who had kept his nation safe through deterrence. To others, he was a driving force behind the escalation of nuclear tensions, a man whose pursuit of power had crossed the line between defense and destruction. Edward Teller died in 2003 at the age of 95. By then, the hydrogen bomb had become less a front-page topic and more a silent presence in the background of world politics. Still in existence, still as devastating as ever, yet largely invisible in daily life. His story, like that of so many scientists who shaped the modern age, is marked by the same paradox: the ability to create extraordinary power, and the burden of knowing what it can do when unleashed. The hydrogen bomb, born of Teller's determination and persistence, remains a chilling testament to how far human ingenuity can reach, and how far it can fall. Victor Frankenstein, Mary Shelley inspiration. In the early years of the 19th century, science was undergoing a quiet transformation. The Enlightenment had already opened minds to reason and discovery, but now the Romantic era was adding questions about the human soul, the boundaries of nature, and the costs of knowledge. Electricity, anatomy, chemistry, all were fields of mystery and potential. It was in this atmosphere of curiosity and unease that a young woman named Mary Shelley began to imagine a story that would echo far beyond her own lifetime. Mary Shelley was only 18 years old in the summer of 1816 when she traveled to Switzerland with her future husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. They stayed near Lake Geneva at the Villa Diodati, where another guest, Lord Byron, suggested that each member of their group should write a ghost story. The challenge was meant as a diversion, but for Mary, it became the seed of a work that would blend science, philosophy, and horror into something entirely new. She had been listening to conversations about recent scientific experiments, in particular the work of Luigi Galvani and Giovanni Aldini, who explored the effects of electricity on muscle tissue. Demonstrations of galvanism showed that electric currents could cause the limbs of dead animals, and even human corpses, to twitch as if animated by life. These unsettling images stayed with Mary. In her imagination, they merged with broader questions about creation, responsibility, and the limits of human ambition. From these influences emerged the figure of Victor Frankenstein, a brilliant young scientist who dares to push beyond the accepted boundaries of natural philosophy. Obsessed with unlocking the secret of life, he pieces together a body from the remains of the dead and brings it to life through methods never fully explained. A deliberate choice that leaves the process mysterious, suspended between science and myth. At first, Victor's experiment is framed as a triumph of intellect and willpower. He has achieved what no one before him has accomplished. But his creation, the creature often mistakenly called Frankenstein, is not the idealized being Victor imagined. Instead, it is a complex and tragic figure, shunned for its appearance and left to navigate a world that offers it neither compassion nor understanding. The heart of Mary Shelley's novel is not the moment of creation, but what comes after. Victor, horrified by the being he has brought to life, abandons it, refusing to accept responsibility for his work. The creature, longing for companionship and connection, becomes increasingly desperate and embittered, leading to a chain of revenge and loss that destroys them both. The story is often read as a parable of scientific hubris, the danger of seeking knowledge without considering its consequences. Yet it is also a meditation on isolation, empathy, and the moral duty of a creator toward their creation. Victor Frankenstein's regret is not only that his experiment caused suffering, but that he failed to guide and care for the life he had made. Over the centuries, Frankenstein has become more than a novel. It has become a symbol. The name itself has entered everyday language as shorthand for any invention that escapes its maker's control. In scientific and political debates, the Frankenstein complex is invoked to describe fears that new technologies, from artificial intelligence to genetic engineering, may one day turn against us. Mary Shelley could not have foreseen the full scope of her story's influence. She wrote it in an age when laboratories were lit by candlelight and powered by crude batteries. Yet its themes feel even more urgent in a world of advanced biotechnology and machine intelligence. At its core, Frankenstein asks a timeless question. Not whether we can create, but whether we are prepared to take responsibility for what we bring into the world. In the fictional life of Victor Frankenstein, regret comes too late. His pursuit of discovery blinds him to the needs of the being he has given life, and by the time he understands the cost, the damage is irreversible. It is a cautionary tale, but also a deeply human one. A reminder that invention without compassion can lead not to progress, but to ruin. More than 200 years after Mary Shelley's story was first published, Victor Frankenstein still walks in the shadow of his creation, carrying the weight of a choice that could never be undone. His is not the regret of an inventor whose design failed, but the deeper, heavier regret of a creator who turned away when he was needed most. Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web. In the late 1980s, the world of computing was a patchwork of isolated systems. Information existed, but it was scattered, locked away in databases, hidden behind proprietary software, stored on machines that could not easily speak to each other. Researchers, scientists, and academics often worked in parallel, unable to easily share the vast amounts of data they were generating. At CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, the problem was especially pressing. Thousands of scientists from dozens of countries were collaborating on complex experiments. Yet their computers ran on different platforms, their documents used incompatible formats, and valuable knowledge was often stranded on individual machines. Tim Berners-Lee, a British computer scientist working at CERN, looked at this fragmented landscape and saw the possibility of something new. He envisioned a system that would allow any document on any computer to be connected to any other, a seamless web of information that could be navigated intuitively without the barriers of technical incompatibility. In 1989, he proposed a solution, the World Wide Web. It would be built on three simple but revolutionary components: HTML for formatting documents, HTTP for transferring them across networks, and URLs for locating them. These building blocks were small in themselves, but together they created a universal language for the digital age. By 1991, Berners-Lee had made the first website accessible, explaining how the system worked and offering the tools for others to create their own pages. Crucially, he chose not to patent or license the technology. He made it free for anyone to use, believing that its value lay in openness. This decision allowed the web to spread at a speed no proprietary system could have matched. Within just a few years, it had transformed from a research tool into a global phenomenon. But as the web grew, it changed in ways Berners-Lee had not imagined, and in some cases in ways he would come to regret. His vision had been one of universal knowledge sharing, a democratic platform where the best ideas could rise through open access. In the early days, websites were often hand-built by individuals or small communities, rich with experimentation and diversity. The web was a place of discovery, curiosity, and collaboration. Over time, however, powerful commercial interests began to dominate. Search engines, social media platforms, and advertising networks reshaped the online landscape. Information was still everywhere, but it was no longer free in the same sense. Personal data became a commodity, traded in ways that many users did not fully understand. Algorithms decided what people saw, subtly influencing opinions and behaviors. The web also became a stage for disinformation, cybercrime, and exploitation, problems Berners-Lee had not foreseen when he first imagined a tool to unite humanity. He has spoken publicly about his disappointment in seeing how the open space he created could be used to spread falsehoods, deepen social divides, and compromise privacy. In interviews, he has said that while he does not regret inventing the web, he regrets some of the directions it has taken. Rather than walk away, Berners-Lee has spent recent years advocating for change. He supports initiatives to decentralize the web, giving users control over their own data and restoring the sense of shared responsibility that marked its beginnings. His work continues through projects like the Solid Platform, designed to shift power away from large corporations and back to individuals. The story of Tim Berners-Lee is not one of an invention gone entirely wrong, but of an invention that escaped the boundaries of its creator's intent. His regret is not for creating the web, but for the ways in which human nature, in pursuit of profit, influence, or control, has twisted a tool meant to empower into one that can also exploit. And yet, the web remains, as he once envisioned, a bridge between people across the globe. It still holds the potential to connect, to educate, to inspire. The challenge, as Berners-Lee sees it, is not to abandon it, but to reclaim it, to steer it back toward the openness and equality at its core. His regret is tempered by determination, a belief that the story of the web is still being written, and that its next chapters need not repeat the mistakes of the past. William Shockley and the Transistor. In the first half of the 20th century, electronics relied heavily on vacuum tubes. These fragile glass cylinders could amplify signals and control electrical currents, but they were bulky, generated excessive heat, consumed large amounts of power, and had a short lifespan. For radio, early computers, and communication systems, vacuum tubes were both a blessing and a limitation, enabling new technologies, yet constraining how far those technologies could go. At Bell Telephone Laboratories in the 1940s, scientists were searching for a better solution. The vision was clear: find a smaller, more reliable device to replace the vacuum tube. This mission brought together three brilliant minds: John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley. Shockley, a physicist with a sharp intellect and a strong ambition to lead, was head of the group. The three set out to explore the possibilities of semiconductors, materials that could conduct electricity under certain conditions but act as insulators under others. In December 1947, their work culminated in a breakthrough. Bardeen and Brattain successfully demonstrated the first point-contact transistor, a small, solid-state device that could amplify electrical signals without the fragility of a vacuum tube. The implications were enormous. Electronics could now be made smaller, faster, and more reliable. Shockley, who had not been directly involved in that exact experiment, quickly set to work on improving the design. His contribution, the junction transistor, refined the technology into a more practical form that would soon revolutionize electronics worldwide. For their combined work, Bardeen, Brattain, and Shockley were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956. The transistor soon became the foundation for the modern electronics industry, powering radios, televisions, computers, and eventually the integrated circuits that would drive the digital age. In terms of sheer impact, it was one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. Yet William Shockley's relationship with his own creation, and with the people around him, was complicated. His ambition often came across as arrogance. At Bell Labs, tensions grew between him and his colleagues. After the Nobel Prize, instead of continuing to work collaboratively, Shockley decided to form his own company, Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory, in Mountain View, California. This move would inadvertently plant the seeds of what would later become Silicon Valley. But his leadership style quickly alienated his staff. He was suspicious, controlling, and prone to making unpredictable decisions. Many of his best employees, including a group later known as the Traitorous Eight, left to form Fairchild Semiconductor, a company that would give birth to much of the modern microelectronics industry. While his invention was thriving in the hands of others, Shockley found himself increasingly isolated from the very revolution he had helped start. His later years brought deeper controversy. In the 1960s and 70s, Shockley began publicly advocating for ideas about human intelligence and genetics that were widely criticized as discriminatory and scientifically flawed. Once celebrated as a pioneer, he became a divisive figure, his reputation overshadowed by his outspoken and unpopular views. Invitations to speak at universities and conferences dwindled, and his name became a source of discomfort rather than pride. For Shockley, the regret was complex. He never denied the importance of the transistor, nor did he claim it should not have been invented. Instead, his bitterness seemed rooted in the fact that while the transistor went on to change the world, he himself was pushed to the sidelines of its story. The wealth and influence that followed the rise of the semiconductor industry largely bypassed him. Worse, his later public positions left him estranged from much of the scientific community. By the time of his death in 1989, the transistor was everywhere, embedded in every computer, every phone, every modern electronic device. It had enabled space exploration, digital communication, and the global information age. But William Shockley, one of its key inventors, was remembered not as a beloved visionary, but as a cautionary tale about ego, ambition, and the unpredictable path an invention can take once it leaves the hands of its creator. The transistor had become an inseparable part of human life, yet for Shockley, it was also a reminder of how personal legacy can diverge sharply from technological triumph. His story shows that even the most groundbreaking creations can bring a sense of loss, not because of the invention itself, but because of the human dynamics, missed opportunities, and choices that follow in its wake. Jack Parsons and rocket technology. In the early decades of the 20th century, the idea of traveling into space was still considered fantasy by most. While writers like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne had imagined voyages beyond Earth, the scientific establishment in the United States regarded rocketry with skepticism, even ridicule. To serious academics, the notion of reaching the stars seemed impractical, even absurd. Against this backdrop appeared a young man named John Whiteside Parsons, better known as Jack Parsons. Born in 1914 in Los Angeles, Parsons was a curious and restless spirit from an early age. He developed a fascination with science fiction, chemistry, and explosives, often experimenting in his backyard with homemade rockets and fuels. Largely self-taught, he lacked formal engineering degrees but possessed an intuitive grasp of chemistry and propulsion that rivaled trained scientists. By the late 1930s, Parsons had connected with a small group of like-minded enthusiasts at the California Institute of Technology. They were outsiders to the academic hierarchy, dismissed by some professors as those rocket boys. Yet their persistence would soon force the world to take them seriously. The group began experimenting with liquid-fueled rockets in the dry Arroyo Seco outside Pasadena, a place where early tests sometimes ended in explosions, billowing smoke, and singed eyebrows. Parsons was a driving force in these experiments. His deep understanding of chemical propellants helped solve critical stability problems that had plagued rocket design. Alongside his colleagues, he co-founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, which would eventually become one of NASA's most important research centers. They also formed Aerojet Engineering, a company that began producing rocket engines for the U.S. military during World War II. But Parsons was more than just a scientist. He lived in two worlds, one of rigorous engineering, and another steeped in mysticism, art, and esoteric philosophy. Outside the laboratory, he became involved with the occult, joining the Ordo Templi Orientis, a group led by the controversial English occultist Aleister Crowley. Parsons believed there was no contradiction between his spiritual pursuits and his scientific work. To him, both were about unlocking hidden forces of the universe. This dual life fascinated and unsettled those around him. In the conservative climate of post-war America, his unconventional beliefs and lifestyle drew suspicion. By the late 1940s, Parsons' association with occult practices, combined with his outspoken political views, led to increasing scrutiny by the government. He lost his security clearance, effectively ending his direct involvement with classified rocket projects. Still, Parsons continued working as a consultant and developing experimental fuels in his home laboratory. He often spoke about the future he believed was inevitable, a future where humans would travel to the moon, establish colonies on other planets, and explore deep space. For him, rocketry was not just a military tool. It was a pathway to expanding human existence beyond Earth. Tragically, his life ended abruptly in 1952. While preparing chemicals for a film project, an explosion tore through his Pasadena home laboratory. Parsons was only 37 years old. The cause of the blast remains debated. Some believe it was an accident, others speculate about sabotage, and some even suggest a deliberate act by Parsons himself. Whatever the truth, his death cut short a career that had already helped lay the foundation for the space age. The rockets Parsons helped design and the propulsion systems he pioneered would go on to power the exploration of space, carrying satellites, astronauts, and probes far beyond what he could have witnessed. Yet his name was largely erased from the mainstream history of spaceflight for decades. His personal life, the mysticism, the scandal, the defiance of social norms, overshadowed his engineering achievements in the public record. Parsons' story carries its own form of regret. He did not live to see the Apollo missions, nor the rise of NASA as a spacefaring agency, developments that owed much to the technology he helped create. Instead, he became a figure whispered about in both aerospace history and occult lore, belonging fully to neither world. Today, historians are beginning to restore his place in the history of rocketry. They remember him as a visionary who believed that human destiny was among the stars. A man whose imagination and technical skill brought that future closer, even if his life ended before he could witness it. For all its contradictions, Parsons' legacy is a reminder that progress is often driven by those who stand at the edges, unafraid to dream of what lies beyond the horizon. Alexander Fleming and Penicillin. In the autumn of 1928, a quiet event unfolded in a modest London laboratory, an event that would change the course of medicine and save hundreds of millions of lives. It began not with a grand experiment or an elaborate plan, but with a simple accident. Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist at St. Mary's Hospital, had been studying Staphylococcus bacteria, known to cause dangerous infections. He was a meticulous researcher, yet like many scientists, he was no stranger to clutter. His workbench was filled with petri dishes, some freshly prepared, others left from earlier trials. Before leaving for a 2-week holiday, he stacked several dishes aside, intending to clean them upon his return. When Fleming came back in September, he noticed something unusual on one dish. The bacterial colonies were growing, except in one area, where a strange blue-green mold had taken root. Around the mold was a clear halo, an empty space where bacteria could not survive. This was not a sign of contamination to be discarded. To Fleming's trained eye, it was a clue, a hint that the mold itself might be producing a substance lethal to bacteria. The mold was later identified as Penicillium notatum. Fleming began isolating the active compound, which he named penicillin. The early results were extraordinary. Penicillin killed harmful bacteria without harming human cells, a rare and precious trait in a potential medicine. It was, in essence, a targeted weapon against infection, something the medical world had been searching for since the dawn of surgery. At the time, however, Fleming's discovery did not cause an immediate revolution. The compound was unstable and difficult to produce in large quantities. Fleming published his findings in 1929, but without the means to purify and manufacture penicillin on a practical scale, the medical community viewed it as a scientific curiosity rather than a breakthrough. Years passed, and the world slipped into another global conflict. It was not until the early 1940s, with World War II raging, that a team at Oxford University, Howard Florey, Ernst Boris Chain, and Norman Heatley, revisited Fleming's work. They developed methods to extract and mass-produce penicillin, turning it into a reliable drug. Their success was nothing short of miraculous. Soldiers wounded in battle, who would have once died from infection, now recovered. Civilians with pneumonia or sepsis were spared. Hospitals began to see once fatal bacterial diseases vanish within days. By the end of the war, penicillin was being called a wonder drug, the dawn of the antibiotic era. Fleming, Florey, and Chain were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1945. The quiet Scottish researcher, once working alone over his petri dishes, became an international figure, celebrated as a man who had given humanity a second chance against disease. But fame brought with it a shadow. As the years went by, Fleming began to see a troubling pattern. Bacteria were evolving. Even in his Nobel lecture, he warned that the misuse of antibiotics, prescribing them for minor illnesses, taking incomplete courses of treatment, could lead to resistant strains. He imagined a future in which penicillin might fail, its power eroded by overuse and neglect. His prediction was chillingly accurate. By the late 20th century, antibiotic resistance had become a growing crisis. In hospitals around the world, doctors began encountering infections immune to nearly every available drug. Fleming's miracle cure, once hailed as a final victory over bacteria, was showing its limits. For Fleming, the regret was not in having discovered penicillin. It was in knowing that humanity might squander its gift. He had seen firsthand how fragile such breakthroughs could be, how easily progress could be undone by carelessness and greed. His legacy was not only the medicine itself but the cautionary message he left behind. That science could offer life-saving tools, but their preservation depended on wisdom, restraint, and responsibility. Today, penicillin remains a cornerstone of modern medicine, though its effectiveness is constantly challenged. Fleming's discovery continues to save lives every day, but it also stands as a reminder that even the most extraordinary advances are not immune to the consequences of human behavior. In that London laboratory nearly a century ago, a bit of neglected mold revealed the key to one of the greatest medical triumphs in history. And yet, for Fleming, the true test was never the discovery. It was whether humanity would prove itself worthy of keeping it. Herbert Boyer and genetic engineering. In the early 1970s, biology was standing at the edge of an uncharted frontier. Scientists were uncovering the molecular mechanisms that made life possible. Yet the idea that humans could deliberately alter the genetic code still lingered at the edge of imagination. Among the pioneers who would take this concept from speculation to reality was a young biochemist from Pittsburgh, Herbert Boyer. Boyer's fascination with living systems began early. As a child, he had an instinctive curiosity about how things worked, not just on the surface, but at their most fundamental levels. His academic journey led him into the intricate world of DNA, the long, twisting molecule that serves as life's instruction manual. By the late 1960s, Boyer was working at the University of California, San Francisco, studying enzymes known as restriction endonucleases. These specialized proteins could cut DNA at precise locations, functioning like molecular scissors. At the time, they were primarily tools for analyzing genetic material, but Boyer began to see a far more profound possibility. In 1972, a chance encounter would set events in motion. Boyer met Stanley Cohen, a geneticist from Stanford University, at a scientific conference in Hawaii. Cohen had been exploring how small, circular DNA molecules called plasmids could move between bacteria, carrying genetic traits with them. Boyer realized that his own work on DNA-cutting enzymes could be combined with Cohen's knowledge of plasmid transfer. Together, they saw the potential for something entirely new. Taking a gene from one organism and inserting it into another, crossing species boundaries that had remained unbroken for billions of years. The experiments they designed were simple in concept but revolutionary in implication. Boyer used his restriction enzymes to cut open a plasmid, creating a gap. Cohen inserted foreign DNA into that gap, and the altered plasmid was introduced into bacteria. The bacteria, reading the new genetic instructions as if they were their own, began producing proteins they had never made before. It was the birth of recombinant DNA technology, the foundation of genetic engineering. For the first time, life's code was not just being read and understood. It was being edited and rewritten. The scientific potential was staggering. In theory, this method could allow the production of valuable proteins like insulin or growth hormones in large quantities, eliminate genetic defects, create disease-resistant crops, and much more. But as news of their success spread through the scientific community, excitement was joined by a wave of concern. The question was not only what could be done, but what should be done. The ability to transfer genes between species raised fears of unintended consequences, the creation of dangerous pathogens, ecological disruptions, or genetic changes that could not be undone. Some voices even spoke of a Pandora's box, warning that once these techniques were released into the world, they could never be contained again. Boyer himself became a central figure in the ethical debate. In 1975, he joined other leading scientists at the Asilomar Conference in California, a historic gathering to establish guidelines for the safe conduct of genetic engineering research. The conference recommended physical and biological containment measures to prevent any possible hazards. For a time, the scientific community voluntarily limited certain types of experiments, recognizing that the ability to alter life carried responsibilities unlike any seen before. But despite the caution, the genie was out of the bottle. In 1976, Boyer co-founded Genentech, the first biotechnology company. Its early achievements included the production of human insulin using genetically modified bacteria, a breakthrough that transformed diabetes treatment. Soon, genetically engineered drugs for anemia, growth disorders, and immune diseases followed. Agriculture began adopting genetically modified crops with improved yields and pest resistance. The revolution that Boyer helped ignite spread across medicine, industry, and food production. Yet as the decades passed, his work also drew criticism and unease. Environmental groups raised alarms about the spread of genetically modified organisms into the wild. Some questioned the concentration of power in corporate biotechnology, where patents on life forms could dictate the future of food and healthcare. Others warned of potential misuse, from bioweapons to unethical human genetic modifications. Boyer did not publicly express regret for his role in creating genetic engineering. He remained convinced of its potential to improve human health and reduce suffering. But he acknowledged the deep responsibility that came with such power. The technology he helped create was not a tool that could simply be turned off. Once the method existed, it would be used for good or for ill. Today, recombinant DNA technology is so embedded in daily life that its origins can feel distant. Yet the ethical dilemmas Boyer faced remain unresolved. Genetic engineering now extends to editing the human germline, reviving extinct species, and potentially altering entire ecosystems through gene drives. The questions first raised in the 1970s still echo. How far should we go? And who gets to decide? In a way, Herbert Boyer's legacy is a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance of human innovation and the weight of human responsibility. By showing that the code of life could be rewritten, he gave the world a tool of extraordinary power. Whether that power will be remembered as humanity's greatest gift or its most dangerous temptation is a chapter still being written. Joseph Weizenbaum and artificial intelligence. In the early 1960s, the field of computing was still in its infancy. Computers were vast, humming machines, their blinking lights and spinning tapes symbols of a new age of possibility. Among the scientists working in this new frontier was Joseph Weizenbaum, a German-born computer scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Weizenbaum had fled Nazi Germany as a teenager, carrying with him not just the memory of authoritarianism, but also a belief in the power of reason and critical thought. His early work was rooted in programming languages and the mechanics of computation. Yet he was also deeply aware that computers were not simply technical devices. They were artifacts shaped by human intentions, and they would, in turn, shape society. In 1966, he created a program that would become one of the most famous and controversial in the history of artificial intelligence. It was called ELIZA. ELIZA was designed to simulate a conversation with a human. One of its most notable scripts, known as Doctor, imitated the style of a Rogerian psychotherapist, responding to user statements with open-ended questions. If someone typed, "I'm feeling anxious," ELIZA might respond, "Why do you think you are feeling anxious?" The program had no understanding of emotions, no insight into psychology. It simply rearranged and mirrored the user's words according to predefined patterns. Weizenbaum had intended ELIZA to be a demonstration, even a parody, of the superficiality of machine understanding. He wanted to show how easily people might mistake a clever simulation for real intelligence. To him, ELIZA was a simple linguistic trick, an amusing tool for illustrating the limits of computation. But what happened next unsettled him. When Weizenbaum allowed others to try the program, he was astonished at the emotional reactions it provoked. Even people who knew they were talking to a machine found themselves opening up, sharing personal thoughts and feelings as if speaking to a trusted confidant. His own secretary once asked him to leave the room so she could have a private conversation with Eliza. It was then that Weizenbaum realized something deeply troubling. Humans could form emotional attachments to machines that offered nothing in return but the illusion of understanding. The danger, he saw, was not that computers might become too intelligent, but that people might willingly hand over their trust, empathy, and decision-making to systems that had none of these qualities. This realization marked a turning point in his career. While many of his contemporaries pursued increasingly ambitious AI research, Weizenbaum became one of the field's most outspoken critics. In his 1976 book Computer Power and Human Reason, he argued that there were boundaries to what computers should be used for. Just because a task could be automated did not mean it should be. Some functions, particularly those involving human judgment, moral reasoning, and empathy, should remain the exclusive domain of people. Weizenbaum warned of a future in which decision-making might be ceded to algorithms, not because they were more capable, but because they were faster, cheaper, and seemingly objective. He saw in Eliza a microcosm of a much larger problem, the human tendency to project understanding onto machines and to let convenience erode critical thinking. His stance was not popular in an era of boundless technological optimism. Colleagues accused him of being a reactionary or of misunderstanding the potential of AI. But Weizenbaum's criticism was never about the technology itself. It was about the social and moral frameworks within which it was deployed. Over time, his warnings began to resonate more widely. As AI systems entered domains like finance, law enforcement, and healthcare, the questions he raised about transparency, accountability, and the human cost of automation became increasingly urgent. His critique of AI was, in essence, a plea for humility, an acknowledgement that some aspects of human life cannot and should not be reduced to code. Joseph Weizenbaum passed away in 2008, long before the explosion of modern AI systems capable of generating text, images, and decisions at a scale unimaginable in his day. Yet his legacy endures not as the creator of one of the first conversational programs, but as the voice of conscience that followed. In Eliza, he saw both the brilliance and the danger of artificial intelligence, a technology that could mirror humanity so convincingly that people might forget it was only a mirror. His regret was not in having created the program, but in realizing how readily people would surrender to the illusion it created. And in that realization, he understood that the greatest risks in AI would come not from the machines themselves, but from the humans who believed in them too much. Ethan Zuckerman and the pop-up ad. In the late 1990s, the internet was in a state of rapid, chaotic growth. Websites were multiplying, new online services were emerging almost daily, and businesses were searching for ways to make money from this vast, open digital space. At the time, the most common method was the banner ad, a rectangular block of promotional content embedded directly into a web page. It was a simple, if somewhat intrusive, approach. But as the web became more commercial, advertisers started to worry about what their brands were appearing next to. Ethan Zuckerman was a young developer working at Tripod.com, a site that offered users free web hosting for personal pages. Tripod's business model relied on advertising to cover the costs of hosting and bandwidth. The problem was that user-generated websites could contain anything, and sometimes advertisers found their ads displayed alongside content they considered inappropriate or damaging to their image. One particular incident stuck in Zuckerman's mind. A large car company had bought ad space on Tripod, but their banner ended up on a page that the brand's marketing team considered offensive. They demanded their ad be removed from that page immediately, but the underlying problem was bigger. On a free web hosting platform, there was no way to guarantee that an ad would only appear next to safe content. Zuckerman began thinking about how to separate ads from the pages themselves, so advertisers wouldn't feel directly associated with whatever content a user had created. His solution was simple but would prove transformative. Instead of placing the ad directly on the page, why not have it open in a separate, smaller browser window? This way, the advertisement would be physically and visually disconnected from the site's content, yet still visible to the visitor. He coded the feature, and the pop-up ad was born. At the time, it seemed like a clever fix to a real problem. It preserved advertiser confidence, allowed Tripod to keep selling ad space, and maintained the free hosting model for users. But the change also had an unintended side effect. Pop-ups became one of the most disliked forms of online advertising in history. In the early days, pop-ups were a novelty. But soon, other companies copied the idea, pushing it to extremes. Advertisers used them aggressively, sometimes triggering multiple windows at once or layering them so they were difficult to close. Some even used scripts that would reopen a window after it had been closed, creating an endless loop of frustration. Users began to associate pop-ups with spam, scams, and malware. The technique, meant as a small technical solution, became a symbol of the worst excesses of online marketing. Zuckerman himself left Tripod and went on to a career focused on technology's social and political impacts. But as the years passed, his association with the invention of the pop-up ad followed him. In 2014, writing for The Atlantic, he openly apologized for creating it, calling it one of the most hated tools in the advertiser's toolkit. He explained the original context, the problem it was meant to solve, and how it spiraled far beyond what he had imagined. His regret was not in the act of solving the problem at Tripod, it was in underestimating how quickly an idea could be adapted, replicated, and distorted once it entered the open web. The pop-up ad was a lesson in the unintended consequences of innovation. A small change designed to address a narrow issue ended up shaping the user experience of the internet for an entire generation, and not in a way that brought joy. Ironically, the backlash against pop-ups spurred another technological development. The rise of pop-up blockers, now a standard feature in most browsers. What had started as a programmer's quick fix became the foundation of an arms race between advertisers and users, each trying to outmaneuver the other in the battle for attention. Today, Zuckerman's work is focused on building a more ethical and user-friendly internet. His career has been marked by efforts to ensure that digital tools empower rather than exploit. But the pop-up ad remains a reminder of how a seemingly harmless technical decision can ripple outward, changing the culture of an entire medium. Ethan Zuckerman never set out to make the internet more annoying. He set out to solve a problem for advertisers and keep a young web service afloat. Yet in doing so, he created one of the most infamous artifacts of early web culture. Proof that even the smallest innovations can take on a life of their own, far beyond the inventor's original intent. Martin Cooper and the mobile phone. In the early 1970s, communication technology was on the brink of a profound transformation. Telephones had been around for nearly a century, but they were still tied to fixed locations, desks, kitchen walls, payphone booths. The idea of talking to someone from anywhere, untethered from cables and physical connections, was a dream for engineers and futurists alike. In this environment, Martin Cooper, an engineer at Motorola, began to imagine something revolutionary. A personal, portable phone that could be carried in one's hand. Cooper had been working in the field of radio communications for years, focusing on ways to transmit voices wirelessly over long distances. His vision was not simply to improve existing car-based radio telephone systems, which were bulky, limited, and expensive, but to make a device that any person could carry, anywhere, at any time. This idea at the time seemed bold, even audacious. The infrastructure to support such a device barely existed, and the components needed to make it practical were still large and power-hungry. In 1973, Motorola decided to invest in this vision, partly as a competitive move against AT&T, which was developing its own mobile technology. Cooper was put in charge of the project. The team worked at a relentless pace, knowing that success would be measured not just by technical achievement, but by being first to demonstrate a truly mobile handheld phone. The device they built, the Dynamite 8000X, was unlike anything the public had seen before. It was large by today's standards, weighing around a kilogram and measuring over 25 centimeters in length. This battery lasted for only about 30 minutes of talk time and required hours to recharge. But in 1973, this was a breakthrough. It was the first phone that did not need to be physically connected to a car, a building, or a wired network point. On April 3, 1973, Martin Cooper made his famous first public call on the prototype. Standing on a sidewalk in New York City, he called Joel Engel, the head of AT&T's rival research team at Bell Labs. Cooper later described that moment as both thrilling and symbolic. The call was not just a technological milestone, but a declaration that personal mobile communication had arrived. The journey from that prototype to a commercially available mobile phone, however, was slow. It took another decade for the first consumer model to reach the market, largely due to the need for building the necessary cellular infrastructure, reducing costs, and improving battery life. When the Dynamite finally went on sale in 1983, it cost nearly $4,000, a luxury item for executives, entrepreneurs, and the wealthy. Yet even at that price, it represented freedom, the ability to make and receive calls from almost anywhere. Over the years, mobile phones evolved rapidly. They became smaller, lighter, and cheaper. Text messaging appeared, followed by internet connectivity, cameras, and eventually the smartphone, a device that put a computer, a camera, and a communication tool in the palm of one's hand. But as mobile phones became indispensable, they also brought unintended consequences. Martin Cooper himself has often spoken about this dual nature of the invention. He remains proud of creating a tool that has connected billions of people across the world, given voice to those without access to traditional infrastructure, and enabled countless new forms of communication. At the same time, he has expressed concern about how the mobile phone has changed human behavior. Cooper has noted that while the original idea was to free people, to let them move, work, and live without being tied to a desk, mobile phones have, in some ways, created new forms of tethering. Instead of being bound to a physical location, people are now bound to a constant stream of notifications, calls, and digital demands. The device designed to enhance personal connection can sometimes undermine it, replacing face-to-face interactions with hurried messages and fragmented attention. In interviews, he has also addressed issues of privacy, distraction, and overuse. The mobile phone, he has argued, is a tool, and like any powerful tool, its effects depend on how it is used. It has enabled emergency responders to act faster, small businesses to operate more efficiently, and families to stay in touch across continents. But it has also contributed to a culture of constant availability, reduced personal boundaries, and in some cases, an unhealthy dependency on the device itself. Decades after that first sidewalk call in Manhattan, Martin Cooper still carries a mobile phone, but he uses it sparingly. He has expressed hope that future generations of devices will become more seamlessly integrated into life, not as distractions, but as silent helpers, working in the background to connect and assist without dominating attention. The mobile phone began as a marvel of engineering and a symbol of freedom. Today, it is nearly ubiquitous, a pocket-sized companion for billions. For Cooper, the achievement remains a point of pride, but also a reminder. Every invention carries within it the potential for outcomes its creator never imagined. What starts as a tool to liberate can, over time, become something that reshapes society in ways both beneficial and challenging. From the first heavy, short-lived prototype to the sleek, powerful devices of today, the mobile phone's journey reflects both the promise and complexity of technological progress. And for Martin Cooper, it stands as a living example of how a single idea, born in the mind of an engineer, can ripple outward to touch nearly every life on Earth, in ways both celebrated and questioned. Ending. Throughout history, even the most brilliant ideas have carried shadows their creators did not foresee. Each scientist in these stories set out with a vision, to solve a problem, to explore the unknown, to push the boundaries of what was possible. And yet, progress often comes with complexity. Inventions that brought connection also brought isolation. Discoveries that promised peace sometimes enabled destruction. Regret does not erase achievement, just as achievement does not erase regret. Instead, they coexist, a reminder that science is not separate from humanity, but deeply bound to it. Every breakthrough reflects both our highest aspirations and our human imperfections. If you enjoyed this journey through the lives of these remarkable minds, consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It helps more people discover these stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which of these cases surprised you most and why? Your voice adds to the conversation, and together, we can keep exploring the fascinating crossroads of science, history, and humanity.